Then Voronwe spoke to the guard of the Gondolin, and his speech they comprehended, for it was the sweet tongue of the gnomes. Then spoke Tuor also, and questioned where they might be, and who might be the folk in arms who stood about, for he was in amaze, and wondered much at the goodly fashion of their weapons. Then it was said to him by one of that company, "We are the guardians of the issue of the way of escape. Rejoice that ye have found it, for behold before you the city of 7 names, where all who war with Melko may find hope." Then said Tuor, "What be those names?" And the chief of the guard made answer, "It is said and it is sung, Gondobar am I called, and Gondolin, city of stone and city of the dwellers in stone. Gondolin, the stone of song, and Gwarestrin am I named, the tower of guard. Gar Thurion, or the secret place, for I am hidden from the eyes of Melko. But they who love me most greatly call me Loth. For like a flower am I, even Lothengriol, the flower that blooms on the plain. Yet, said he, in our daily speech we speak and we name it mostly Gondolin. Then said Voronwe, Bring us thither, for we fain would enter. And Tuor said that his heart desired much to tread the ways of that fair city. Then said the chief of the guard that they themselves must abide here, for there were yet many days of their moon of watch to pass, but that Voronwe and Tuor might pass on to Gondolin, and moreover that they would need thereto no guide, for, lo, it stands fair to see and very clear, and its towers prick the heavens above the hill of watch in the midmost plain. Then Tuor and his companion fared over the plain that was of a marvellous level, broken but here and there by boulders round and smooth which lay amid a sward, and by pools in rocky beds. Many fair pathways lay across that plain, and they came after a day's light march to the foot of the hill of watch, which is in the tongue of the Noldali Amon Gwareth. Then did they begin to ascend the winding stairways which climbed up to the city gate, nor might any one reach that city save on foot, and espied from the walls. As the westward gate was golden in the last sunlight, did they come to the long stairs' head, and many eyes gazed upon them from the battlements and towers. But Tuor looked upon the walls of stone, and the uplifted towers, upon the glistering pinnacles of the town, and he looked upon the stairs of stone and marble, bordered by slender balustrades and cooled by the leap of thread-like waterfalls seeking the plain from the fountains of Amon Gwareth. And he fared as one in some dream of the gods, for he deemed not such things were seen by men in the visions of their sleep. So great was his amaze at the glory of Gondolin. Even so came they to the gates, Tuor in wonder, and Voronwe in great joy that daring much he had both brought Tuor hither in the will of Ulmo, and had himself thrown off the yoke of Melko for ever. Though he hated him no wise less, no longer did he dread that evil one with a binding terror. And of a sooth that spell which Melko held over the Noldali was one of bottomless dread, so that he seemed ever nigh them, even were they far from the hells of iron, and their hearts quaked, and they fled not even when they could, and to this Melko trusted often. Now is there a sally from the gates of Gondolin, and a throng comes about these twain in wonder, rejoicing that yet another of the Noldali has fled hither from Melko, and marvelling at the stature and the great limbs of Tuor, his heavy spear barbed with fishbone, and his great harp. Rugged was his aspect, and his locks were unkempt, and he was clad in the skins of bears. It is written that in those days the fathers of men were of less stature than men now are, and the children of Elfines of greater growth. Yet was Tuor taller than any that stood there. Indeed, the Gondolin were not bent of back as some of their unhappy kin became, labouring without rest at delving and hammering for Melko, but small were they, and slender, and very lithe. They were swift of foot and surpassing fair, sweet and sad were their mouths, and their eyes had ever a joy within quivering to tears. For in those times the gnomes were exiles at heart, haunted with a desire for their ancient homes that faded not. But fate and unconquerable eagerness after knowledge had driven them into far places, and now were they hemmed by Melko, and must make their abiding as fair as they might by labour and by love. How it came ever that among men the Noldali have been confused with the orcs who are Melko's goblins, I know not, unless it be that certain of the Noldali were twisted to the evil of Melko and mingled among these orcs. For all that race were bred by Melko of the subterranean heats and slime. Their hearts were of granite, and their bodies deformed. Foul their faces which smiled not, but their laugh that of the clash of metal. And to nothing were they more fain than to aid in the basest of the purposes of Melko. The greatest hatred was between them and the Noldali, who named them Glamhoth, or folk of dreadful hate. Behold, the armed guardians of the gate pressed back the thronging folk that gathered about the wanderers, and one among them spoke, saying, "This is a city of watch and ward, Gondolin on Amon Gwareth, where all may be free who are of true heart, but none may be free to enter unknown. Tell me then your names." But Voronwe named himself Bronweg of the Gnomes, come hither by the will of Ulmo as guide to this son of men. And Tuor said, "I am Tuor, son of Peleg, son of Indor, of the house of the Swan, of the sons of the men of the north who live far hence. And I fare hither by the will of Ulmo, of the outer oceans." Then all who listened grew silent, and his deep and rolling voice held them in amaze, for their own voices were fair as the plash of fountains. Then a saying arose among them, "Lead him before the king." Then did the throng return within the gates, and the wanderers with them, and Tuor saw they were of iron, and of great height and strength. Now the streets of Gondolin were paved with stone, and wide, curbed with marble, and fair houses and courts amid gardens of bright flowers were set about the ways, and many towers of great slenderness and beauty, builded of white marble and carved most marvellously, rose to the heaven. Squares there were, lit with fountains, and the home of birds that sang amid the branches of their aged trees. But of all these, the greatest was that place where stood the king's palace, and the tower thereof was the loftiest in the city. And the fountains that played before the doors shot 20 fathoms and 7 in the air, and fell in a singing rain of crystal. Therein did the sun glitter splendidly by day, and the moon most magically shimmered by night. The birds that dwelt there were of the whiteness of snow, and their voices sweeter than a lullaby of music. On either side of the doors of the palace were 2 trees, one that bore blossom of gold and the other of silver, nor did they ever fade, for they were shoots of old from the glorious trees of Valinor, that lit those places before Melko and Gloomweaver withered them. And those trees the Gondoth Lim named Glingol and Bansil. Then Turgon, king of Gondolin, robed in white with a belt of gold, and a coronet of garnets was upon his head, stood before his doors and spoke from the head of the white stairs that led thereto. "Welcome, O man of the land of shadows! Lo, thy coming was set in our books of wisdom, and it has been written that there would come to pass many great things in the homes of the Gondoth Lim, whenso thou faredst hither." Then spoke Tuor, and Ulmo set power in his heart, and majesty in his voice. "Behold, O father of the city of stone, I am bidden by him who maketh deep music in the abyss, and who knoweth the mind of elves and men, to say unto thee that the days of release draw nigh. There have come to the ears of Ulmo whispers of your dwelling and your hill of vigilance against the evil of Melko, and he is glad. But his heart is wroth, and the hearts of the Valar are angered, who sit in the mountains of Valinor, and look upon the world from the peak of Taniquetil, seeing the sorrow of the thraldom of the Noldoli, and the wanderings of men. for Melko ringeth them in the land of shadows beyond the hills of iron. Therefore have I been brought by a secret way to bid you number your hosts and prepare for battle, for the time is ripe. Then spoke Turgon, That will I not do, though it be the words of Ulmo and all the Valar. I will not adventure this my people against the terror of the orcs, nor imperil my city against the fire of Melko. Then spoke Tuor, Nay, if thou dost not now dare greatly, then will the orcs dwell forever, and possess in the end most of the mountains of the earth, and cease not to trouble both elves and men, even though by other means the Valar contrive hereafter to release the Noldali. But if thou trust now to the Valar, though terrible the encounter, then shall the orcs fall, and Melko's power be minished to a little thing. But Turgon said that he was king of Gondolin, and no will should force him against his counsel to imperil the dear labour of long ages gone. But Tuor said, for thus was he bidden by Ulmo, who had feared the reluctance of Turgon, Then am I bidden to say that men of the Gondolin repair swiftly and secretly down the river Sirion to the sea, and there build them boats, and go seek back to Valinor. Lo, the paths thereto are forgotten, and the highways faded from the world, and the seas and mountains are about it. Yet still dwell there the elves on the hill of Kor, and the gods sit in Valinor, though their mirth is minished for sorrow and fear of Melko. And they hide their land and weave about it inaccessible magic that no evil come to its shores. Yet still might thy messengers win there, and turn their hearts that they rise in wrath and smite Melko, and destroy the hells of iron that he has wrought beneath the mountains of darkness. Then said Turgon, Every year at the lifting of winter have messengers repaired swiftly and by stealth down the river that is called Sirion to the coasts of the great sea, and there builded them boats whereto have swans and gulls been harnessed, or the strong wings of the wind, and these have sought back beyond the moon and sun to Valinor. But the paths thereto are forgotten, and the highways faded from the world, and the seas and mountains are about it, and they that sit within in mirth reck little of the dread of Melko or the sorrow of the world, but hide their land and weave about it inaccessible magic, that no tidings of evil come ever to their ears. Nay, enough of my people have for years untold gone out to the wide waters never to return, but have perished in the deep places, or wander now lost in the shadows that have no paths. And at the coming of next year no more shall fare to the sea, but rather will we trust to ourselves and our city for the warding off of Melko, and thereto have the Valar been of scant help aforetime. Then Tuor's heart was heavy, and Voronwë wept, and Tuor sat by the great fountain of the king, and its splashing recalled the music of the waves, and his soul was troubled by the conches of Ulmo, and he would return down the waters of Sirion to the sea. But Turgon, who knew that Tuor, mortal as he was, had the favour of the Valar, marking his stout glance and the power of his voice, sent to him and bade him dwell in Gondolin, and be in his favour, and abide even in the royal halls if he would. Then Tuor, for he was weary, and that place was fair, said yea. And hence cometh the abiding of Tuor in Gondolin. Of all Tuor's deeds among the Gondolin, the tales tell not. But it is said that many a time would he have stolen thence, growing weary of the concourses of folk, and thinking of empty forest and fell, or hearing afar the sea music of Ulmo, had not his heart been filled with love for a woman of the Gondolin, and she was a daughter of the king. Now Tuor learnt many things in those realms taught by Voronwë whom he loved, and who loved him exceeding greatly in return, or else was he instructed by the skilled men of the city and the wise men of the king. Wherefore he became a man far mightier than aforetime, and wisdom was in his counsel, and many things became clear to him that were unclear before, and many things known that are still unknown to mortal men. There he heard concerning that city of Gondolin, and how unstaying labour through ages of years had not sufficed to its building and adornment, whereat folk travailed yet. Of the delving of that hidden tunnel he heard, which the folk named the Way of Escape, and how there had been divided counsels in that matter, yet pity for the enthralled Nolderley had prevailed in the end to its making. Of the guard without ceasing he was told, that was held there in arms, and likewise at certain low places in the encircling mountains, and how watchers dwelt ever vigilant on the highest peaks of that range, beside builded beacons ready for the fire. For never did that folk cease to look for an onslaught of the orcs, did their stronghold become known. Now, however, was the guard of the hills maintained rather by custom than necessity. For the Gondolin had long ago with unimagined toil levelled and cleared and delved all that plain about Amon Gwareth, so that scarce gnome or bird or beast or snake could approach, but was espied from many leagues off. For among the Gondolin were many whose eyes were keener than the very hawks of Manwe Sulimo, lord of gods and elves, who dwells upon Taniquetil. And for this reason did they call that vale Tum Laden, or the Valley of Smoothness. Now this great work was finished to their mind, and folk were the busier about the quarrying of metals, and the forging of all manner of swords and axes, spears and bills, and the fashioning of coats of mail, byrnies and hauberks, greaves and vambraces, helms and shields. Now it was said to Tuor that already the whole folk of Gondolin, shooting with bows without stay, day or night, might not expend their hoarded arrows in many years, and that yearly their fear of the orcs grew the less for this. There learnt Tuor of building with stone, of masonry and the hewing of rock and marble. Crafts of weaving and spinning, broidery and painting did he fathom, and cunning in metals. Musics most delicate he there heard, and in these were they who dwelt in the southern city the most deeply skilled, for there played a profusion of murmuring founts and springs. Many of these subtleties Tuor mastered and learned to entwine with his songs, to the wonder and heart's joy of all who heard. Strange stories of the sun and moon and stars, of the manner of the earth and its elements, and of the depths of heaven were told to him. And the secret characters of the elves he learnt, and their speeches and old tongues, and heard tell of Ilúvatar, the Lord for always, who dwelleth beyond the world, of the great music of the Ainur about Ilúvatar's feet in the uttermost deeps of time, whence came the making of the world and the manner of it, and all therein, and their governance. Now for his skill and his great mastery over all lore and craft whatsoever, and his great courage of heart and body, did Tuor become a comfort and stay to the king who had no son, and he was beloved by the folk of Gondolin. Upon a time the king caused his most cunning artificers to fashion a suit of armour for Tuor as a great gift, and it was made of gnome steel overlaid with silver. But his helm was adorned with a device of metals and jewels, like to two swan wings, one on either side, and a swan's wing was wrought on his shield. But he carried an axe rather than a sword, and this in the speech of the Gondolin he named Dramborleg, for its buffet stunned and its edge clove all armour. A house was built for him upon the southern walls, for he loved the free airs and liked not the close neighbourhood of other dwellings. There it was his delight often to stand on the battlements at dawn, and folk rejoiced to see the new light catch the wings of his helm, and many murmured and would fain have backed him into battle with the orcs, seeing that the speeches of those two, Tuor and Turgon, before the palace were known to many. But the matter went not further for reverence of Turgon, and because at this time in Tuor's heart the thought of the words of Ulmo seemed to have grown dim and far off. Now came days when Tuor had dwelt among the Gondolin many years. Long had he known and cherished a love for the king's daughter, and now was his heart full of that love. Great love, too, had Idril for Tuor, and the strands of her fate were woven with his, even from that day when first she gazed upon him from a high window as he stood a way-worn suppliant before the palace of the king. Little cause had Turgon to withstand their love, for he saw in Tuor a kinsman of comfort and great hope. Thus was first wed a child of men with a daughter of elfiness, nor was Tuor the last. Less bliss have many had than they, and their sorrow in the end was great. Yet great was the mirth of those days when Idril and Tuor were wed before the folk in Gar Einion, the place of the gods, nigh to the king's halls. A day of merriment was that wedding to the city of Gondolin, and of the greatest happiness to Tuor and Idril. Thereafter dwelt they in joy in that house upon the walls that looked out south over Tumladen, and this was good to the hearts of all in the city, save Meglin alone. Now that nome was come of an ancient house, though now were its numbers less than others. But he himself was nephew to the king by his mother the king's sister Isfin, and that tale may not here be told. Now the sign of Meglin was a sable mole, and he was great among quarrymen and a chief of the delvers after ore, and many of these belonged to his house. Less fair was he than most of this goodly folk, swart and of none too kindly mood, so that he won small love, and whispers there were that he had orc's blood in his veins, but I know not how this could be true. Now he had bid often with the king for the hand of Idril, yet Turgon, finding her very loath, had as often said nay. For him seemed Meglin's suit was caused as much by the desire of standing in high power beside the royal throne, as by love of that fair maid. Fair indeed was she, and brave thereto, and the people called her Idril of the silver feet, in that she went ever barefoot and bareheaded, king's daughter as she was, save only at pomps of the Ainur. And Meglin gnawed his anger, seeing Tuor thrust him out. In these days came to pass the fulfilment of the time of the desire of the Valar, and the hope of the Eldalier. For in great love Idril bore to Tuor a son, and he was called Eorendel. Now thereto there are many interpretations both among elves and men, but belike it was a name wrought of some secret tongue among the Gondolin, and that has perished with them from the dwellings of the earth. Now this babe was of greatest beauty, his skin of a shining white, and his eyes of a blue surpassing that of the sky in southern lands, bluer than the sapphires of the raiment of Manwë. And the envy of Meglin was deep at his birth, but the joy of Turgon and all the people very great indeed. Behold, now many years have gone since Tuor was lost amid the foothills, and deserted by those Noldali. Yet many years too have gone since to Melkor's ears came first those strange tidings, faint were they and various in form, of a man wandering amid the dales of the waters of Sirion. Now Melkor was not much afraid of the race of men in those days of his great power, and for this reason did Ulmo work through one of this kindred for the better deceiving of Melkor, seeing that no Valar and scarce any of the Eldar or Noldali might stir unmarked of his vigilance. Yet none the less foreboding smote that ill heart at the tidings, and he got together a mighty army of spies. Sons of the orcs were there, with eyes of yellow and green like cats, that could pierce all glooms and see through mist or fog or night. Snakes that could go every whither, and search all crannies or the deepest pits or the highest peaks, listen to every whisper that ran in the grass or echoed in the hills. Wolves there were, and ravening dogs, and great weasels full of the thirst of blood, whose nostrils could take scent moons old through running water, or whose eyes find among shingle footsteps that had passed a lifetime since. Owls came, and falcons, whose keen glances might descry by day or night the fluttering of small birds in all the woods of the world, and the movement of every mouse or vole or rat that crept or dwelt throughout the earth. All these he summoned to his hall of iron, and they came in multitudes. Thence he sent them over the earth to seek this man who had escaped from the land of shadows, but yet far more curiously and more intently to search out the dwelling of the Noldali that had escaped his thraldom. For these his heart burnt to destroy or to enslave. Now while Tuor dwelt in happiness and in great increase of knowledge and might in Gondolin, these creatures through the years, untiring, nosed among the stones and rocks, hunted the forests and the heaths, espied the airs and lofty places, tracked all the paths about the dales and plains, and neither let nor stayed. From this hunt they brought a wealth of tidings to Melko. Indeed, among many hidden things that they dragged to light, they discovered that way of escape whereby Tuor and Veronwe entered aforetime. Nor had they done so save by constraining some of the less stout of the Noldali with dire threats of torment to join in that great ransacking. For because of the magic about that gate, no folk of Melko unaided by the gnomes could come to it. Yet now they had pried of late far into its tunnels, and captured within many of the Noldali creeping there to flee from thraldom. They had scaled too the encircling hills at certain places, and gazed upon the beauty of the city of Gondolin, and the strength of Amon Gwareth from afar. But into the plain they could not win, for the vigilance of its guardians, and the difficulty of those mountains. Indeed, the Gondolin were mighty archers, and bows they made of a marvel of power. Therewith they might shoot an arrow into heaven 7 times as far as could the best bowman among men shoot at a mark upon the ground. And they would have suffered no falcon to hover long over their plain, or snake to crawl therein. For they liked not creatures of blood, broodlings of Melko. Now in those days was Earendel 1 year old when these ill tidings came to that city of the spies of Melko, and how they encompassed the vale of Tumladen around. Then Turgon's heart was saddened, remembering the words of Tuor in past years before the palace doors, and he caused the watch and ward to be thrice strengthened at all points, and engines of war to be devised by his artificers and set upon the hill. Poisonous fires and hot liquids, arrows and great rocks was he prepared to shoot down on any who would assail those gleaming walls, and then he abode as well content as might be. But Tuor's heart was heavier than the king's, for now the words of Ulmo came ever to his mind, and their purport and gravity he understood more deeply than of old. Nor did he find any great comfort in Idril, for her heart boded more darkly even than his own. Know then that Idril had a great power of piercing with her thought the darkness of the hearts of elves and men, and the glooms of the future thereto, further even than is the common power of the kindreds of the Eldalier. Therefore she spoke thus on a day to Tuor: Know, my husband, that my heart misgives me for doubt of Meglin, and I fear that he will bring an ill on this fair realm, though by no means may I see how or when. Yet I dread lest all that he knows of our doings and preparations become in some manner known to the foe, so that he devise a new means of whelming us, against which we have thought of no defence. Lo, I dreamed on a night that Meglin builded a furnace, and coming at us unawares, flung therein Earendel our babe, and would after thrust in thee and me, but that for sorrow at the death of our fair child I would not resist. And Tuor answered, There is reason in thy fear, for neither is my heart good towards Meglin. Yet is he the nephew of the king and thine own cousin, nor is there charge against him, and I see naught to do but to abide and watch. But Idril said, This is my rede thereto. Gather thou in deep secret those delvers and quarrymen who by careful trial are found to hold least love for Meglin by reason of the pride and arrogance of his dealings among them. From these thou must choose trusty men to keep watch upon Meglin, whenso he fares to the outer hills. Yet I counsel thee to set the greater part of those in whose secrecy thou canst confide at a hidden delving, and to devise with their aid, howsoever cautious and slow that labour be, a secret way from thy house here beneath the rocks of this hill unto the vale below. Now this way must not lead toward the way of escape, for my heart bids me trust it not, but even to that far distant pass, the cleft of the eagles in the southern mountains. And the further this delving reached thitherward beneath the plain, so much the better would I esteem it. Yet let all of this labour be kept dark, save from a few. Now there are none such delvers of earth and rock as the Noldorli, and this Melko knows. But in those places is the earth of a great hardness, and Tuor said, The rocks of the hill of Amon-Gwareth are as iron, and only with much travail may they be cloven. Yet if this be done in secret, then must great time and patience be added. But the stone of the floor of the vale of Tumladen is as forged steel, nor may it be hewn without the knowledge of the Gondolin, save in moons and years. Idril said then, Sooth this may be, but such is my rede, and there is yet time to spare. Then Tuor said that he might not see all its purport, but better is any plan than a lack of counsel, and I will do even as thou sayest. Now it so chanced that not long after, Meglin went to the hills for the getting of ore, and straying in the mountains alone, was taken by some of the orcs prowling there, and they would do him evil and terrible hurt, knowing him to be a man of the Gondolin. This was, however, unknown of Tuor's watchers. But evil came into the heart of Meglin, and he said to his captors, Know then that I am Meglin, son of Eol, who had to wife Isfin, sister of Turgon, king of the Gondolin. But they said, What is that to us? And Meglin answered, Much is that to you, for if you slay me, be it speedy or slow, ye will lose great tidings concerning the city of Gondolin, that your master would rejoice to hear. Then the orcs stayed their hands, and said they would give him life if the matters he opened to them seemed to merit that. And Meglin told them of all the fashion of that plain and city, of its walls and their height and thickness, and the valour of its gates. Of the host of men-at-arms who now obeyed Turgon he spoke, and the countless hoard of weapons gathered for their equipment, of the engines of war and the venomous fires. Then the orcs were wroth, and having heard these matters were yet for slaying him there and then, as one who impudently enlarged the power of his miserable folk to the mockery of the great might and puissance of Melko. But Meglin, catching at a straw, said, Think ye not that ye would rather pleasure your master, if ye bore to his feet so noble a captive, that he might hear my tidings of himself, and judge of their verity? Now this seemed good to the orcs, and they returned from the mountains about Gondolin to the hills of iron and the dark halls of Melko. Thither they hailed Meglin with them, and now was he in a sore dread. But when he knelt before the black throne of Melko in terror of the grimness of the shapes about him, of the wolves that sat beneath that chair and of the adders that twined about its legs, Melko bade him speak. Then told he those tidings, and Melko, hearkening, spoke very fair to him, that the insolence of his heart in great measure returned. Now the end of this was that Melko, aided by the cunning of Meglin, devised a plan for the overthrow of Gondolin. For this Meglin's reward was to be a great captaincy among the orcs. Yet Melko purposed not in his heart to fulfil such a promise, but Tuor and Earendel should Melko burn, and Idril be given to Meglin's arms, and such promises was that evil one fain to redeem. Yet as meed of treachery did Melko threaten Meglin with the torment of the Balrogs. Now these were demons with whips of flame and claws of steel, by whom he tormented those of the Noldali who durst withstand him in anything, and the Eldar have called them Malkarauki. But the rede that Meglin gave to Melko was that not all the host of the Orcs nor the Balrogs in their fierceness might by assault or siege hope ever to overthrow the walls and gates of Gondolin, even if they availed to win unto the plain without. Therefore he counselled Melko to devise out of his sorceries a succour for his warriors in their endeavour. From the greatness of his wealth of metals and his powers of fire, he bid him make beasts like snakes and dragons of irresistible might, that should overcreep the encircling hills, and lap that plain and its fair city in flame and death. Then Meglin was bidden fare home, lest at his absence men suspect somewhat. But Melko wove about him the spell of bottomless dread, and he had thereafter neither joy nor quiet in his heart. Nonetheless he wore a fair mask of good liking and gaiety, so that men said, Meglin is softened, and he was held in less disfavour, yet Idril feared him the more. Now Meglin said, I have laboured much, and am minded to rest, and to join in the dance and the song and the merrymakings of the folk. And he went no more quarrying stone or ore in the hills, yet in sooth he sought herein to drown his fear and disquiet. A dread possessed him that Melko was ever at hand, and this came of the spell, and he durst never again wander amid the mines, lest he again fall in with the Orcs, and be bidden once more to the terrors of the halls of darkness. Now the years fare by, and egged by Idril, Tuor keepeth ever at his secret delving. But seeing that the leaguer of spies hath grown thinner, Turgon dwelleth more at ease and in less fear. Yet these years are filled by Melko in the utmost ferment of labour, and all the thrall folk of the Noldali must dig unceasingly for metals, while Melko sitteth and deviseth fires and calleth flames and smokes to come from the lower heats. Nor doth he suffer any of the Noldali to stray ever a foot from their places of bondage. Then on a time Melko assembled all his most cunning smiths and sorcerers, and of iron and flame they wrought a host of monsters, such as have only at that time been seen, and shall not again be till the great end. Some were all of iron so cunningly linked that they might flow like slow rivers of metal, or coil themselves around and above all obstacles before them, and these were filled in their innermost depths with the grimmest of the Orcs with scimitars and spears. Others of bronze and copper were given hearts and spirits of blazing fire, and they blasted all that stood before them with the terror of their snorting, or trampled whatso escaped the ardour of their breath. Yet others were creatures of pure flame, that writhed like ropes of molten metal, and they brought to ruin whatever fabric they came nigh, and iron and stone melted before them and became as water. And upon them rode the Balrogs in hundreds. And these were the most dire of all those monsters which Melko devised against Gondolin. Now when the 7th summer had gone since the treason of Meglin, and Earendel was yet of very tender years, though a valorous child, Melko withdrew all his spies, for every path and corner of the mountains was now known to him. Yet the Gondolin thought in their unwariness that Melko would no longer seek against them, perceiving their might and the impregnable strength of their dwelling. But Idril fell into a dark mood, and the light of her face was clouded, and many wondered thereat. Yet Turgon reduced the watch and ward to its ancient numbers, and to somewhat less, and as autumn came, and the gathering of fruits was over, folk turned with glad hearts to the feasts of winter. But Tuor stood upon the battlements, and gazed upon the encircling hills. Now behold, Idril stood beside him, and the wind was in her hair, and Tuor thought that she was exceeding beautiful, and stooped to kiss her. But her face was sad, and she said, Now come the days when thou must make choice. And Tuor knew not what she said. Then drawing him within their halls, she said to him how her heart misgave her, for fear concerning Earendel their son, and foreboding that some great evil was nigh, and that Melko would be at the bottom of it. Then Tuor would comfort her, but might not, and she questioned him concerning the secret delving, and he said how it now led a league into the plain, and at that was her heart somewhat lightened. But still she counselled that the delving be pressed on, and that henceforth should speed way more than secrecy, because now is the time very near. And another rede she gave him, and this he took also, that certain of the bravest and most true among the lords and warriors of the Gondolin be chosen with care and told of that secret way and its issue. These she counselled him to make into a stout guard, and to give them his emblem to wear, that they become his folk, and to do this under pretext of the right and dignity of a great lord, kinsman to the king. Moreover, said she, I will get my father's favour to that. In secret, too, she whispered to folk that if the city came to its last stand, or Turgon be slain, that they rally about Tuor and her son. And to this they laughed a yea, saying, however, that Gondolin would stand as long as Tiniquitil or the mountains of Valinor. Yet to Turgon she spoke not openly, nor suffered Tuor to do so, as he desired, despite their love and reverence for him, a great and a noble and a glorious king he was, seeing that he trusted in Meglin, and held with blind obstinacy his belief in the impregnable might of the city, and that Melko sought no more against it, perceiving no hope therein. Now in this he was ever strengthened by the cunning sayings of Meglin. Behold, the guile of that gnome was very great, for he wrought much in the dark, so that folk said, He doth well to bear the sign of a sable mole. And by reason of the folly of certain of the quarrymen, and yet more by reason of the loose words of certain among his kin to whom word was somewhat unwarily spoken by Tuor, he gathered a knowledge of the secret work, and laid against that a plan of his own. So winter deepened, and it was very cold for those regions, so that frost fared about the plain of Tumladen, and ice lay on its pools. Yet the fountains played ever on Amon Gwareth, and the two trees blossomed, and folk made merry, till the day of terror that was hidden in the heart of Melko. In these ways that bitter winter passed, and the snows lay deeper than ever before on the encircling hills. Yet in its time a spring of wondrous glory melted the skirts of those white mantles, and the valley drank the waters and burst into flowers. So came and passed with revelry of children the festival of Nost Nalothion, or the birth of flowers, and the hearts of the Gondolin were uplifted for the good promise of the year. And now at length is that great feast Tarnin Auster, or the gates of summer, near at hand. For know that on a night it was their custom to begin a solemn ceremony at midnight, continuing it even till the dawn of Tarnin Auster broke, and no voice was uttered in the city from midnight till the break of day, but the dawn they hailed with ancient songs. For years uncounted had the coming of summer thus been greeted with music of choirs standing upon their gleaming eastern wall. And now comes even the night of vigil, and the city is filled with silver lamps, while in the groves upon the new-leaved trees lights of jewelled colours swing, and low musics go along the ways, but no voice sings until the dawn. The sun has sunk beyond the hills, and folk array them for the festival very gladly and eagerly, glancing in expectation to the east. Lo, even when she had gone and all was dark, a new light suddenly began, and a glow there was, but it was beyond the northward heights, and men marvelled, and there was a thronging of the walls and battlements. Then wonder grew to doubt as the light waxed and became yet redder, and doubt to dread as men saw the snow upon the mountains dyed as it were with blood. And thus it was that the fire-serpents of Melko came upon Gondolin. Then came over the plain riders who bore breathless tidings from those who kept vigil on the peaks. And they told of the fiery hosts and the shapes like dragons, and said, Melko is upon us. Great was the fear and anguish within that beauteous city, and the streets and byways were filled with the weeping of women and the wailing of children, and the squares with the mustering of soldiers and the ring of arms. There were the gleaming banners of all the great houses and kindreds of the Gondolin. Mighty was the array of the house of the king, and their colours were white and gold and red, and their emblems the moon and the sun and the scarlet hart. Now in the midmost of these stood Tuor above all heads, and his mail of silver gleamed, and about him was a press of the stoutest of the folk. Lo, all these wore wings as it were of swans or gulls upon their helms, and the emblem of the white wing was upon their shields. But the folk of Meglin were drawn up in the same place, and sable was their harness, and they bore no sign or emblem, but their round caps of steel were covered with moleskin, and they fought with axes two-headed like mattocks. There Meglin, prince of Gondobar, gathered many warriors of dark countenance and lowering gaze about him, and a ruddy glow shone upon their faces and gleamed about the polished surfaces of their accoutrement. Behold, all the hills to the north were ablaze, and it was as if rivers of fire ran down the slopes that led to the plain of Tumladen, and folk might already feel the heat thereof. And many other kindreds were there, the folk of the Swallow and the Heavenly Arch, and from these folk came the greatest number and the best of the bowmen, and they were arrayed upon the broad places of the walls. Now the folk of the Swallow bore a fan of feathers on their helms, and they were arrayed in white and dark blue, and in purple and black, and showed an arrowhead on their shields. Their lord was Duilin, swiftest of all men to run and leap, and surest of archers at a mark. But they of the Heavenly Arch, being a folk of uncounted wealth, were arrayed in a glory of colours, and their arms were set with jewels that flamed in the light now over the sky. Every shield of that battalion was of the blue of the heavens, and its boss a jewel built of 7 gems, rubies and amethysts and sapphires, emeralds, chrysoprase, topaz and amber. But an opal of great size was set in their helms. Egalmoth was their chieftain, and wore a blue mantle upon which the stars were broidered in crystal, and his sword was bent. Now none else of the Noldorli bore curved swords. Yet he trusted rather to the bow, and shot therewith further than any among that host. There too were the folk of the Pillar, and of the Tower of Snow, and both these kindreds were marshalled by Penlod, tallest of gnomes. There were those of the Tree, and they were a great house, and their raiment was green. They fought with iron-studded clubs or with slings, and their lord Galdor was held the most valiant of all the Gondolin, save Turgon alone. There stood the house of the Golden Flower, who bore a rayed sun upon their shield, and their chief Glorfindel bore a mantle so broidered in threads of gold that it was diapered with celandine as a field in spring, and his arms were damascened with cunning gold. Then came there from the south of the city the people of the Fountain, and Ecthelion was their lord, and silver and diamonds were their delight, and swords very long and bright and pale did they wield, and they went into battle to the music of flutes. Behind them came the host of the Harp, and this was a battalion of brave warriors, but their leader Salgant was a craven, and he fawned upon Meglin. They were dight with tassels of silver and tassels of gold, and a harp of silver shone in their blazonry upon a field of black. But Salgant bore one of gold, and he alone rode into battle of all the sons of the Gondolin, and he was heavy and squat. Now the last of the battalions was furnished by the folk of the Hammer of Wrath, and of these came many of the best smiths and craftsmen, and all that kindred reverenced Aule the smith more than all other Ainur. They fought with great maces like hammers, and their shields were heavy, for their arms were very strong. In older days they had been much recruited by Noldali who escaped from the mines of Melko, and the hatred of this house for the works of that evil one and the Balrogs his demons was exceeding great. Now their leader was Rog, strongest of the gnomes, scarce second in valour to that Galdor of the Tree. The sign of this people was the stricken anvil, and a hammer that smiteth sparks about it was set on their shields, and red, gold, and black iron was their delight. Very numerous was that battalion, nor had any amongst them a faint heart, and they won the greatest glory of all those fair houses in that struggle against doom. Yet were they ill-fated, and none ever fared away from that field, but fell about Rog and vanished from the earth, and with them much craftsmanship and skill has vanished forever. This was the fashion and the array of the 11 houses of the Gondolin, with their signs and emblems, and the bodyguard of Tuor, the folk of the Wing, was accounted the 12th. Now is the face of that chieftain grim, and he looks not to live long. And there in his house upon the walls Idril arrays herself in mail, and seeks Eärendil. And that child was in tears for the strange lights of red that played about the walls of the chamber where he slept, and tales that his nurse Meleth had woven him concerning fiery Melko at times of his waywardness came to him and troubled him. But his mother coming set about him a tiny coat of mail that she had let fashion in secret, and at that he was glad and exceeding proud, and he shouted for pleasure. Yet Idril wept, for much had she cherished in her heart the fair city and her goodly house, and the love of Tuor and herself that had dwelt therein. But now she saw its destroying nigh at hand, and feared that her contriving would fail against this overwhelming might of the terror of the serpents. It was now 4 hours still from the middle night, and the sky was red in the north and in the east and west. And those serpents of iron had reached the levels of Tumladen, and those fiery ones were among the lowest slopes of the hills, so that the guards were taken and set in evil torment by the Balrogs that scoured all about, saving only to the furthest south, where was Cristhorn, the cleft of eagles. Then did King Turgon call a council, and thither fared Tuor and Meglin as royal princes, and Duilin came with Egalmoth and Penlod the Tall, and Rog strode thither with Galdor of the Tree and Golden Glorfindel and Ecthelion of the Voice of Music. Thither too fared Salgant a tremble at the tidings, and other nobles beside of less blood, but better heart. Then spoke Tuor, and this was his rede, that a mighty sally be made forthwith, ere the light and heat grew too great in the plain, and many backed him, being but of different minds as to whether the sally should be made by the entire host, with the maids and wives and children amidmost, or by diverse bands seeking out in many directions, and to this last Tuor leaned. But Meglin and Salgant alone held other counsel, and were for holding to the city and seeking to guard those treasures that lay within. Out of guile did Meglin speak thus, fearing lest any of the Noldali escape the doom that he had brought upon them, and he dreaded lest his treason become known and somehow vengeance find him in after days. But Salgant spoke, both echoing Meglin and being grievously afraid of issuing from the city, for he was fain rather to do battle from an impregnable fortress than to risk hard blows upon the field. Then the lord of the House of the Mole played upon the one weakness of Turgon, saying, Lo, O king, the city of Gondolin contains a wealth of jewels and metals and stuffs and of things wrought by the hands of the gnomes to surpassing beauty, and all these thy lords, more brave, meseems, than wise, would abandon to the foe. Even should victory be thine upon the plain, thy city will be sacked, and the Balrogs get hence with a measureless booty. And Turgon groaned, for Meglin had known his great love for the wealth and loveliness of that burg upon Amon Gwareth. Again said Meglin, putting fire in his voice, Lo, hast thou for naught laboured through years uncounted at the building of walls of impregnable thickness, and in the making of gates whose valour may not be overthrown? Is the power of the hill Amon Gwareth become as lowly as the deep vale? Or the hoard of weapons that lie upon it, and its unnumbered arrows, of so little worth that in the hour of peril thou wouldst cast all aside, and go naked into the open against enemies of steel and fire, whose trampling shakes the earth, and the encircling mountains ring with the clamour of their footsteps? And Salgant quailed to think of it, and spoke noisily, saying, Meglin speaks well, O king, hear thou him. Then the king took the counsel of those twain, though all the lords said otherwise, nay, rather the more for that. Therefore at his bidding does all that folk abide now the assault upon their walls. But Tuor wept, and left the king's hall, and gathering the men of the wing went through the streets seeking his home, and by that hour was the light great and lurid, and there was stifling heat, and a black smoke and stench arose about the pathways to the city. And now came the monsters across the valley, and the white towers of Gondolin reddened before them. But the stoutest were in dread, seeing those dragons of fire and those serpents of bronze and iron that fare already about the hill of the city, and they shot unavailing arrows at them. Then is there a cry of hope, for behold, the snakes of fire may not climb the hill for its steepness and for its glassiness, and by reason of the quenching waters that fall upon its sides. Yet they lie about its feet, and a vast steam arises, where the streams of Amon Gwareth and the flames of the serpents drive together. Then grew there such a heat that women became faint, and men sweated to weariness beneath their mail, and all the springs of the city, save only the fountain of the king, grew hot and smoked. But now Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, captain of the hosts of Melko, took counsel and gathered all his things of iron that could coil themselves around and above all obstacles before them. These he bade pile themselves before the northern gate, and behold, their great spires reached even to its threshold, and thrust at the towers and bastions about it. And by reason of the exceeding heaviness of their bodies, those gates fell, and great was the noise thereof. Yet the most of the walls around them still stood firm. Then the engines and the catapults of the king poured darts and boulders and molten metals on those ruthless beasts, and their hollow bellies clanged beneath the buffeting. Yet it availed not, for they might not be broken, and the fires rolled off them. Then were the topmost opened about their middles, and an innumerable host of the orcs, the goblins of hatred, poured therefrom into the breach. And who shall tell of their scimitars, or the flash of their broad-bladed spears with which they stabbed? Then did Rog shout in a mighty voice, and all the people of the Hammer of Wrath and the kindred of the Tree with Galdor the Valiant leapt at the foe. There the blows of their great hammers and the dint of their clubs rang to the encircling mountains, and the orcs fell like leaves, and those of the Swallow and the Arch poured arrows like the dark rains of autumn upon them, and both orcs and Gondolin fell thereunder for the smoke and the confusion. Great was that battle. Yet for all their valour the Gondolin, by reason of the might of ever-increasing numbers, were borne slowly backwards, till the goblins held part of the northernmost city. At this time is Tuor at the head of the folk of the wing, struggling in the turmoil of the streets, and now he wins through to his house and finds that Meglin is before him. Trusting in the battle now begun about the northern gate and in the uproar in the city, Meglin had looked to this hour for the consummation of his designs. Learning much of the secret delving of Tuor, yet only at the last moment had he got this knowledge, and he could not discover all, he said naught to the king or any other, for it was his thought that of a surety that tunnel would go in the end toward the way of escape, this being the most nigh to the city, and he had a mind to use this to his good, and to the ill of the Nolderly. Messengers by great stealth he dispatched to Melko to set a guard about the outer issue of that way when the assault was made. But he himself thought now to take Earendel, and cast him into the fire beneath the walls, and seizing Idril, he would constrain her to guide him to the secrets of the passage, that he might win out of this terror of fire and slaughter, and drag her withal along with him to the lands of Melko. Now Meglin was afeard that even the secret token which Melko had given him would fail in that direful sack, and was minded to help that Ainu to the fulfilment of his promises of safety. No doubt had he, however, of the death of Tuor in that great burning, for to Salgant he had confided the task of delaying him in the king's halls, and egging him straight thence into the deadliest of the fight. But lo, Salgant fell into a terror unto death, and he rode home and lay there now a quake on his bed. But Tuor fared home with the folk of the wing. Now Tuor did this, though his valour leapt to the noise of war, that he might take farewell of Idril and Earendel, and speed them with a bodyguard down the secret way, ere he returned himself to the battle throng, to die if must be. But he found a press of the mole folk about his door, and these were the grimmest and least good-hearted of folk that Meglin might get in that city. Yet were they free Noldorly, and under no spell of Melko's like their master, wherefore, though for the lordship of Meglin they aided not Idril, no more would they touch of his purpose, despite all his curses. Now then Meglin had Idril by the hair, and sought to drag her to the battlements out of cruelty of heart, that she might see the fall of Earendel to the flames. But he was cumbered by that child, and she fought, alone as she was, like a tigress for all her beauty and slenderness. There he now struggles and delays amid oaths, while that folk of the wing draws nigh, and lo, Tuor gives a shout so great that the orcs hear it afar and waver at the sound of it. Like a crash of tempest the guard of the wing were amid the men of the mole, and these were stricken asunder. When Meglin saw this, he would stab Earendel with a short knife he had, but that child bit his left hand, that his teeth sank in, and he staggered and stabbed weakly, and the mail of the small coat turned the blade aside, and thereupon Tuor was upon him, and his wrath was terrible to see. He seized Meglin by that hand that held the knife, and broke the arm with the wrench, and then taking him by the middle, leapt with him upon the walls, and flung him far out. Great was the fall of his body, and it smote Amon-Gwareth 3 times, ere it pitched into the midmost of the flames. And the name of Meglin has gone out in shame from among Eldar and Noldorly. Then the warriors of the mole, being more numerous than those few of the wing, and loyal to their lord, came at Tuor, and there were great blows. But no man might stand before the wrath of Tuor, and they were smitten and driven to fly into what dark holes they might, or flung from the walls. Then Tuor and his men must get them to the battle of the gate, for the noise of it has grown very great, and Tuor has it still in his heart that the city may stand. Yet with Idril he left their Voronwë against his will, and some other swordsman to be guard for her till he returned or might send tidings from the fray. Now was the battle at that gate very evil indeed, and Duilin of the Swallow, as he shot from the walls, was smitten by a fiery bolt of the Balrogs, who leapt about the base of Amon-Gwareth, and he fell from the battlements and perished. Then the Balrogs continued to shoot darts of fire and flaming arrows like small snakes into the sky, and these fell upon the roofs and gardens of Gondolin till all the trees were scorched, and the flowers and grass burned up, and the whiteness of those walls and colonnades was blackened and seared. Yet a worse matter was it, that a company of those demons climbed upon the coils of the serpents of iron, and thence loosed unceasingly from their bows and slings, till a fire began to burn in the city to the back of the main army of the defenders. Then said Rog in a great voice, "Who now shall fear the Balrogs for all their terror? See before us the accursed ones who for ages have tormented the children of the Noldorly, and who now set a fire at our backs with their shooting. Come ye of the Hammer of Wrath, and we will smite them for their evil." Thereupon he lifted his mace, and its handle was long, and he made a way before him by the wrath of his onset even unto the fallen gate. But all the people of the stricken anvil ran behind like a wedge, and sparks came from their eyes for the fury of their rage. A great deed was that sally, as the Noldorly sing yet, and many of the orcs were borne backward into the fires below. But the men of Rog leapt even upon the coils of the serpents, and came at those Balrogs and smote them grievously. For all they had whips of flame and claws of steel, and were in stature very great. They battered them into naught, or catching at their whips wielded these against them, that they tore them even as they had aforetime torn the gnomes. And the number of Balrogs that perished was a marvel and dread to the hosts of Melko, for ere that day never had any of the Balrogs been slain by the hand of elves or men. Then Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, gathered all his demons that were about the city, and ordered them thus. A number made for the folk of the Hammer, and gave before them, but the greater company, rushing upon the flank, contrived to get to their backs, higher upon the coils of the drakes, and nearer to the gates, so that Rog might not win back save with great slaughter among his folk. But Rog, seeing this, essayed not to win back, as was hoped, but with all his folk fell on those whose part was to give before him, and they fled before him now of dire need rather than of craft. Down into the plain were they harried, and their shrieks rent the airs of Tumladen. Then that house of the Hammer fared about smiting and hewing the astonied bands of Melko, till they were hemmed at the last by an overwhelming force of the orcs and the Balrogs, and a fire drake was loosed upon them. There did they perish about Rog, hewing to the last till iron and flame overcame them. And it is yet sung that each man of the Hammer of Wrath took the lives of 7 foemen to pay for his own. Then did dread fall more heavily still upon the Gondolin at the death of Rog and the loss of his battalion, and they gave back further yet into the city, and Penlod perished there in a lane with his back to the wall, and about him many of the men of the Pillar, and many of the Tower of Snow. Now therefore Melko's goblins held all the gate, and a great part of the walls on either side, whence numbers of the Swallow and those of the Rainbow were thrust to doom. But within the city they had won a great space reaching nigh to the centre, even to the place of the well that adjoined the square of the palace. Yet about those ways and around the gate their dead were piled in uncounted heaps, and they halted therefore and took counsel, seeing that for the valour of the Gondolin they had lost many more than they had hoped, and far more than those defenders. Fearful too they were for that slaughter Rog had done amid the Balrogs, because of those demons they had great courage and confidence of heart. Now then the plan that they made was to hold what they had won, while those serpents of bronze and with great feet for trampling climbed slowly over those of iron, and reaching the walls there opened a breach wherethrough the Balrogs might ride upon the dragons of flame. Yet they knew this must be done with speed, for the heats of those drakes lasted not forever, and might only be plenished from the wells of fire that Melko had made in the fastness of his own land. But even as their messengers were sped, they heard a sweet music that was played amid the host of the Gondolin, and they feared what it might mean. And lo, there came Ecthelion, and the people of the fountain whom Turgon till now had held in reserve, for he watched the most of that affray from the heights of his tower. Now marched these folk to a great playing of their flutes, and the crystal and silver of their array was most lovely to see amid the red light of the fires and the blackness of the ruins. Then on a sudden their music ceased, and Ecthelion of the fair voice shouted for the drawing of swords, and before the orcs might foresee his onslaught, the flashing of those pale blades was amongst them. It is said that Ecthelion's folk there slew more of the goblins than fell ever in all the battles of the Eldalier with that race, and that his name is a terror among them to this latest day, and a war cry to the Eldar. Now it is that Tuor and the men of the wing fare into the fight, and range themselves beside Ecthelion and those of the fountain, and the twain strike mighty blows, and ward each many a thrust from the other, and harry the orcs so that they win back almost to the gate. But there behold a quaking and a trampling, for the dragons labour mightily at beating a path up Amon Gwareth, and at casting down the walls of the city. and already there is a gap therein, and a confusion of masonry where the ward towers have fallen in ruin. Bands of the Swallow and of the Arch of Heaven there fight bitterly amid the wreck, or contest the walls to east and west with the foe. But even as Tuor comes nigh driving the orcs, one of those brazen snakes heaves against the western wall, and a great mass of it shakes and falls, and behind comes a creature of fire, and Balrogs upon it. Flames gust from the jaws of that worm, and folk wither before it, and the wings of the helm of Tuor are blackened. But he stands and gathers about him his guard and all of the Arch and Swallow he can find, whereas on his right Ecthelion rallies the men of the Fountain of the South. Now the orcs again take heart from the coming of the drakes, and they mingle with the Balrogs that pour about the breach, and they assail the Gondolin grievously. There Tuor slew Othrod, a lord of the orcs, cleaving his helm, and Balkmeg he hewed asunder, and Lug he smote with his axe that his limbs were cut from beneath him at the knee. But Ecthelion shore through 2 captains of the goblins at a sweep, and cleft the head of Orcabal, their chiefest champion, to his teeth. And by reason of the great doughtiness of those 2 lords, they came even unto the Balrogs. Of those demons of power Ecthelion slew 3, for the brightness of his sword cleft the iron of them and did hurt to their fire, and they writhed. Yet of the leap of that axe Dramborleg that was swung by the hand of Tuor were they still more afraid, for it sang like the rush of eagles' wings in the air, and took death as it fell, and 5 of them went down before it. But so it is that few cannot fight always against the many, and Ecthelion's left arm got a sore rent from a whip of the Balrogs, and his shield fell to earth even as that dragon of fire drew nigh amid the ruin of the walls. Then Ecthelion must lean on Tuor, and Tuor might not leave him, though the very feet of the trampling beast were upon them, and they were like to be overborne. But Tuor hewed at a foot of the creature so that flames spouted forth, and that serpent screamed, lashing with its tail, and many of both orcs and Noldali got their death therefrom. Now Tuor gathered his might and lifted Ecthelion, and amid a remnant of the folk got thereunder and escaped the drake. Yet dire was the killing of men that beast had wrought, and the Gondolin was sorely shaken. Thus it was that Tuor, son of Peleg, gave before the foe, fighting as he yielded ground, and bore from that battle Ecthelion of the Fountain. But the drakes and the foemen held half the city, and all the north of it. Thence marauding bands fared about the streets and did much ransacking, or slew in the dark men and women and children, and many, if occasion let, they bound and led back and flung in the iron chambers amid the dragons of iron, that they might drag them afterward to be thralls of Melko. Now Tuor reached the square of the Folkwell by a way entering from the north, and found there Galdor denying the western entry by the Arch of Inway to a horde of the goblins, but about him was now but a few of those men of the tree. There did Galdor become the salvation of Tuor, for he fell behind his men stumbling beneath Ecthelion over a body that lay in the dark, and the orcs had taken them both, but for the sudden rush of that champion and the dint of his club. There were the scatterlings of the guard of the wing and of the houses of the tree and the fountain and of the swallow and the arch, welded to a good battalion, and by the counsel of Tuor they gave way out of that place of the well, seeing that the square of the king that lay next was the more defensible. Now that place had aforetime contained many beautiful trees, both oak and poplar, around a great well of vast depth and great purity of water. Yet at that hour it was full of the riot and ugliness of those hideous people of Melko, and those waters were polluted with their carcasses. Thus comes the last stout gathering of those defenders in the square of the palace of Turgon. Among them are many wounded and fainting, and Tuor is weary for the labours of the night and the weight of Ecthelion, who is in a deadly swoon. Even as he led that battalion in by the road of arches from the northwest, and they had much ado to prevent any foe getting behind their backs, a noise arose at the eastward of the square, and lo, Glorfindel is driven in with the last of the men of the Golden Flower. Now these had sustained a terrible conflict in the great market to the east of the city, where a force of orcs led by Balrogs came on them at unawares as they marched by a circuitous way to the fight about the gate. This they did to surprise the foe upon his left flank, but were themselves ambuscaded. There fought they bitterly for hours, till a fire-drake new come from the breach overwhelmed them, and Glorfindel cut his way out very hardly and with few men. But that place with its stores and its goodly things of fine workmanship was a waste of flames. The story tells that Turgon had sent the men of the Harp to their aid, because of the urgency of messengers from Glorfindel, but Salgant concealed this bidding from them, saying they were to garrison the square of the lesser market to the south where he dwelt, and they fretted thereat. Now, however, they brake from Salgant, and were come before the king's hall, and that was very timely, for a triumphant press of foemen was at Glorfindel's heels. On these the men of the Harp unbidden fell with great eagerness, and utterly redeemed the cravenhood of their lord, driving the enemy back into the market, and being leaderless fared even over wrathfully, so that many of them were trapped in the flames or sank before the breath of the serpent that revelled there. Tuor now drank of the great fountain and was refreshed, and loosening Ecthelion's helm gave him to drink, splashing his face that his swoon left him. Now those lords Tuor and Glorfindel clear the square and withdraw all the men they may from the entrances and bar them with barriers, save as yet on the south. Even from that region comes now Egalmoth. He had had charge of the engines on the wall, but long since deeming matters to call rather for hand-strokes about the streets than shooting upon the battlements, he gathered some of the arch and of the swallow about him, and cast away his bow. Then did they fare about the city, dealing good blows whenever they fell in with bands of the enemy. Thereby he rescued many bands of captives, and gathered no few wandering and driven men, and so got to the king's square with hard fighting, and men were fain to greet him, for they had feared him dead. Now are all the women and children that had gathered there or been brought in by Egalmoth stowed in the king's halls, and the ranks of the houses made ready for the last. In that host of survivors are some, be it however few, of all the kindreds, save of the Hammer of Wrath alone, and the king's house is as yet untouched. Nor is this any shame, for their part was ever to bide fresh to the last and defend the king. But now the men of Melko have assembled their forces, and 7 dragons of fire have come with orcs about them and Balrogs upon them, down all the ways from north, east, and west, seeking the square of the king. Then there was carnage at the barriers, and Egalmoth and Tuor went from place to place of the defence, but Ecthelion lay by the fountain, and that stand was the most stubborn valiant that is remembered in all the songs or in any tale. Yet at long last a drake bursts the barrier to the north, and there had once been the issue of the Alley of Roses, and a fair place to see or to walk in. But now there is but a lane of blackness, and it is filled with noise. Tuor stood then in the way of that beast, but was sundered from Egalmoth, and they pressed him backward even to the centre of the square nigh the fountain. There he became weary from the strangling heat, and was beaten down by a great demon, even Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, son of Melko. But lo, Ecthelion, whose face was of the pallor of grey steel, and whose shield-arm hung limp at his side, strode above him as he fell, and that gnome drove at the demon, yet did not give him his death, getting rather a wound to his sword-arm that his weapon left his grasp. Then leapt Ecthelion, lord of the fountain, fairest of the Noldali, full at Gothmog, even as he raised his whip, and his helm that had a spike upon it he drove into that evil breast, and he twined his legs about his foeman's thighs, and the Balrog yelled and fell forward. But those two dropped into the basin of the king's fountain, which was very deep. There found that creature his bane, and Ecthelion sank steel-laden into the depths. and so perished the Lord of the Fountain after fiery battle in cool waters. Now Tuor had arisen when the assault of Ecthelion gave him space, and seeing that great deed he wept for his love of that fair gnome of the fountain. But being wrapped in battle he scarce cut his way to the folk about the palace. There seeing the wavering of the enemy by reason of the dread of the fall of Gothmog the marshal of the hosts, the royal house laid on, and the king came down in splendour among them and hewed with them, that they swept again much of the square, and of the Balrog slew even 200, which is a very great prowess indeed. But greater still did they do, for they hemmed in one of the fire drakes for all his flaming, and forced him into the very waters of the fountain, that he perished therein. Now this was the end of that fair water, and its pools turned to steam, and its spring was dried up, and it shot no more into the heaven, but rather a vast column of vapour arose to the sky, and the cloud therefrom floated over all the land. Then dread fell on all for the doom of the fountain, and the square was filled with mists of scalding heat and blinding fogs, and the people of the royal house were killed therein by heat, and by the foe, and by the serpents, and by one another. But a body of them saved the king, and there was a rally of men beneath Glingol and Bansil. Then said the king, "Great is the fall of Gondolin." And men shuddered, for such were the words of Amnon the prophet of old. But Tuor, speaking wildly for ruth and love of the king, cried, "Gondolin stands yet, and Ulmo will not suffer it to perish." Now they were at that time standing, Tuor by the trees, and the king upon the stairs, as they had stood aforetime when Tuor spoke the embassy of Ulmo. But Turgon said, "Evil have I brought upon the flower of the plain, in despite of Ulmo, and now he leaveth it to wither in the fire. Lo, hope is no more in my heart for my city of loveliness. But the children of the Noldali shall not be worsted for ever." Then did the Gondolin clash their weapons, for many stood nigh. But Turgon said, "Fight not against doom, O my children. Seek ye who may safety and flight, if perhaps there be time yet, but let Tuor have your lealty." But Tuor said, "Thou art king." And Turgon made answer, "Yet no blow will I strike more." And he cast his crown at the roots of Glingol. Then did Galdor, who stood there, pick it up. But Turgon accepted it not, and bare of head climbed to the topmost pinnacle of that white tower that stood nigh his palace. There he shouted in a voice like a horn blown among the mountains, and all that were gathered beneath the trees and the foemen in the mists of the square heard him. "Great is the victory of the Noldali!" And it is said that it was then middle night, and that the orcs yelled in derision. Then did men speak of a sally, and were of two minds. Many held that it were impossible to burst through, nor might they even so get over the plain or through the hills, and that it were better therefore to die about the king. But Tuor might not think well of the death of so many fair women and children, were it at the hands of their own folk in the last resort, or by the weapons of the enemy. And he spoke of the delving, and of the secret way. Therefore did he counsel that they beg Turgon to have other mind, and coming among them, lead that remnant southward to the walls and the entry of that passage. But he himself burnt with desire to fare thither, and know how Idril and Earendel might be, or to get tidings hence to them, and bid them be gone speedily, for Gondolin was taken. Now Tuor's plan seemed to the lords desperate indeed, seeing the narrowness of the tunnel and the greatness of the company that must pass it, yet would they fain take this rede in their straits. But Turgon hearkened not, and bid them fare now ere it was too late, and "Let Tuor," said he, "be your guide and your chieftain. But I, Turgon, will not leave my city, and will burn with it." Then sped they messengers again to the tower, saying, Sire, who are the Gondolin, if thou perish? Lead us. But he said, Lo, I abide here. And a third time, and he said, If I am king, obey my behests, and dare not to parley further with my commands. After that they sent no more, and made ready for the forlorn attempt. But the folk of the royal house that yet lived would not budge a foot, but gathered thickly about the base of the king's tower. Here, said they, we will stay, if Turgon goes not forth. And they might not be persuaded. Now was Tuor torn sorely between his reverence for the king and the love for Idril and his child, wherewith his heart was sick. Yet already serpents fare about the square, trampling upon dead and dying, and the foe gathers in the mists for the last onslaught, and the choice must be made. Then, because of the wailing of the women in the halls of the palace, and the greatness of his pity for that sad remainder of the peoples of Gondolin, he gathered all that rueful company, maids, children, and mothers, and setting them amidmost, marshalled as well as he might his men around them. Deepest he set them at flank and at rear, for he purposed falling back southward, fighting as best he might with the rearguard as he went, and thus, if it might so be, to win down the road of Pomps to the place of the gods, ere any great force be sent to circumvent him. Thence was it his thought to go by the way of running waters past the fountains of the south, to the walls and to his home, but the passage of the secret tunnel he doubted much. Thereupon, espying his movement, the foe made forthwith a great onslaught upon his left flank and his rear, from east and north, even as he began to withdraw. But his right was covered by the king's hall, and the head of that column drew already into the road of Pomps. Then some hugest of the drakes came on and glared in the fog, and he must perforce bid the company to go at a run, fighting on the left at haphazard. But Glorfindel held the rear manfully, and many more of the golden flower fell there. So it was that they passed the road of Pomps, and reached Gar Einion, the place of the gods. And this was very open, and at its middle the highest ground of all the city. Here Tuor looks for an evil stand, and it is scarce in his hope to get much further. But behold, the foe seems already to slacken, and scarce any follow them, and this is a wonder. Now comes Tuor at their head to the place of wedding, and lo, there stands Idril before him with her hair unbraided, as on that day of their marriage before, and great is his amaze. By her stood Veronwe and none other, but Idril saw not even Tuor, for her gaze was set back upon the place of the king, that now lay somewhat below them. Then all that host halted and looked back, whither her eyes gazed, and their hearts stood still, for now they saw why the foe pressed them so little, and the reason of their salvation. Lo, a drake was coiled even on the very steps of the palace, and defiled their whiteness. But swarms of the orcs ransacked therein, and dragged forth forgotten women and children, or slew men that fought alone. Glingol was withered to the stock, and Bansil was blackened utterly, and the king's tower was beset. High up they could descry the form of the king, but about the base a serpent of iron spouting flame lashed and rode with his tail, and balrogs were round him, and there was the king's house in great anguish, and dread cries carried up to the watchers. So was it that the sack of the halls of Turgon and that most valiant stand of the royal house held the mind of the foe, so that Tuor got thence with his company, and stood now in tears upon the place of the gods. Then said Idril, Woe is me, whose father awaiteth doom even upon his topmost pinnacle. But 7 times woe, whose lord hath gone down before Melko, and will stride home no more. For she was distraught with the agony of that night. Then said Tuor, Lo, Idril, it is I, and I live. Yet now will I get thy father hence, be it from the hells of Melko. With that he would make down the hill alone, maddened by the grief of his wife. But she, coming to her wits in a storm of weeping, clasped his knees, saying, my lord, and delayed him. Yet even as they spoke, a great noise and a yelling rose from that place of anguish. Behold, the tower leapt into a flame, and in a stab of fire it fell, for the dragons crushed the base of it, and all who stood there. Great was the clangour of that terrible fall, and therein passed Turgon, king of the Gondolin, and for that hour the victory was to Melko. Then said Idril heavily, sad is the blindness of the wise. But Tuor said, sad too is the stubbornness of those we love. Yet it was a valiant fault. Then stooping he lifted and kissed her, for she was more to him than all the Gondolin. But she wept bitterly for her father. Then turned Tuor to the captains, saying, lo, we must get hence with all speed, lest we be surrounded. And forthwith they moved onward as swiftly as they might, and got them far from thence, ere the orcs tired of sacking the palace, and rejoicing at the fall of the tower of Turgon. Now are they in the southward city, and meet but scattered bands of plunderers who fly before them. Yet do they find fire and burning everywhere for the ruthlessness of that enemy. Women do they meet, some with babes and some laden with chattels, but Tuor would not let them bear away aught save a little food. Coming now at length to a greater quiet, Tuor asked Voronwë for tidings, in that Idril spoke not and was well nigh in a swoon. And Voronwë told him of how she and he had waited before the doors of the house, while the noise of those battles grew and shook their hearts. And Idril wept for lack of tidings from Tuor. At length she had sped the most part of her guard down the secret way with Eärendil, constraining them to depart with imperious words. Yet was her grief great at that sundering. She herself would bide, said she, nor seek to live after her lord. And then she fared about gathering womenfolk and wanderers, and speeding them down the tunnel, and smiting marauders with her small band, nor might they dissuade her from bearing a sword. At length they had fallen in with a band somewhat too numerous, and Voronwë had dragged her thence but by the luck of the gods, for all else with them perished, and their foe burned Tuor's house, yet found not the secret way. Therewith, said Voronwë, thy lady became distraught of weariness and grief, and fared into the city wildly to my great fear, nor might I get her to sally from the burning. About the saying of these words were they come to the southern walls and nigh to Tuor's house. And lo, it was cast down, and the wreckage was a smoke, and thereat was Tuor bitterly wroth. But there was a noise that boded the approach of orcs, and Tuor dispatched that company as swiftly as might be down that secret way. Now is there great sorrow upon that staircase, as those exiles bid farewell to Gondolin. Yet are they without much hope of further life beyond the hills, for how shall any slip from the hand of Melko? Glad is Tuor when all have passed the entrance, and his fear lightens. Indeed, by the luck of the Valar only can all the folk have got therein unspied of the orcs. Some now are left who, casting aside their arms, labour with picks from within, and block up the entry of the passage, faring then after the host as they might. But when that folk had descended the stairway to a level with the valley, the heat grew to a torment, for the fire of the dragons that were about the city, and they were indeed nigh, for the delving there was at no great depth in the earth. Boulders were loosened by the tremors of the ground, and falling crushed many, and fumes were in the air, so that their torches and lanterns went out. Here they fell over bodies of some that had gone before and perished, and Tuor was in fear for Eärendil, and they pressed on in great darkness and anguish. Nigh 2 hours were they in that tunnel of the earth, and towards its end it was scarce finished, but rugged at the sides and low. Then came they at the last, lessened by well-nigh a tithe, to the tunnel's opening, and it debouched cunningly in a large basin where once water had lain, but it was now full of thick bushes. Here were gathered no small press of mingled folk whom Idril and Voronwe had sped down the hidden way before them, and they were weeping softly in weariness and sorrow, that Eärendil was not there. Thereat were Tuor and Idril in anguish of heart. Lamentation was there too among all those others, for amidmost of the plain about them loomed afar the hill of Amangwareth crowned with flames, where had stood the gleaming city of their home. Fire-drakes are about it, and monsters of iron fare in and out of its gates, and great is that sack of the Balrogs and Orcs. Somewhat of comfort has this none the less for the leaders, for they judge the plain to be nigh empty of Melko's folk save hard by the city, for thither have fared all his evil ones to revel in that destruction. Now, therefore, said Galdor, we must get as far hence toward the encircling mountains as may be ere dawn come upon us, and that giveth no great space of time, for summer is at hand. Thereat rose a dissension, for a number said that it were folly to make for Cristhorn as Tuor purposed. The sun, say they, will be up long ere we win the foothills, and we shall be whelmed in the plain by those drakes and those demons. Let us fare to Bad Uthwen, the way of escape, for that is but half the journeying, and our weary and our wounded may hope to win so far, if no further. Yet Idril spoke against this, and persuaded the lords that they trust not to the magic of that way that had aforetime shielded it from discovery. For what magic stands, if Gondolin be fallen? None the less a large body of men and women sundered from Tuor, and fared to Bad Uthwen, and there into the jaws of a monster who by the guile of Melko at Meglin's Reed sat at the outer issue that none came through. But the others, led by Legolas Greenleaf of the House of the Tree, who knew all that plain by day or by dark, and was night-sighted, made much speed over the vale for all their weariness, and halted only after a great march. Then was all the earth spread with the grey light of that sad dawn, which looked no more on the beauty of Gondolin. But the plain was full of mists, and that was a marvel, for no mist or fog came there ever before, and this perchance had to do with the doom of the Fountain of the King. Again they rose, and covered by the vapours fared long past dawn in safety, till they were already too far away for any to descry them in those misty airs, from the hill or from the ruined walls. Now the mountains, or rather their lowest hills, were on that side 7 leagues save a mile from Gondolin, and Cristhorn, the cleft of eagles, 2 leagues of upward going from the beginning of the mountains, for it was at a great height. Wherefore they had yet 2 leagues and part of a third to traverse amid the spurs and foothills, and they were very weary. By now the sun hung well above a saddle in the eastern hills, and she was very red and great, and the mists nigh them were lifted, but the ruins of Gondolin were utterly hidden, as in a cloud. Behold then, at the clearing of the airs they saw, but a few furlongs off, a knot of men that fled on foot, and these were pursued by a strange cavalry, for on great wolves rode orcs, as they thought, brandishing spears. Then said Tuor, Lo, there is Eärendil my son. Behold, his face shineth as a star in the waste, and my men of the wing are about him, and they are in sore straits. Forthwith he chose 50 of the men that were least weary, and leaving the main company to follow, he fared over the plain with that troop as swiftly as they had strength left. Coming now to carry a voice, Tuor shouted to the men about Eärendil to stand and flee not, for the wolf-riders were scattering them and slaying them piecemeal. And the child was upon the shoulders of one Hendor, a housecarl of Idril's, and he seemed like to be left with his burden. Then they stood back to back, and Hendor and Eärendil amidmost, but Tuor soon came up, though all his troop were breathless. Of the wolf-riders there were a score, and of the men that were about Eärendil but 6 living. Therefore had Tuor opened his men into a crescent of but 1 rank, and hoped so to envelop the riders, lest any escaping bring tidings to the main foe and draw ruin upon the exiles. In this he succeeded, so that only 2 escaped, and therewithal wounded and without their beasts, wherefore were their tidings brought too late to the city. Glad was Earendel to greet Tuor, and Tuor most fain of his child. But said Earendel, I am thirsty, father, for I have run far, nor had Hendor need to bear me. Thereto his father said naught, having no water, and thinking of the need of all that company that he guided. But Earendel said again, It was good to see Meglin die so, for he would set arms about my mother, and I liked him not. But I would travel in no tunnels for all Melko's wolf-riders. Then Tuor smiled and set him upon his shoulders. Soon after this the main company came up, and Tuor gave Earendel to his mother, who was in great joy. But Earendel would not be borne in her arms, for he said, Mother Idril, thou art weary, and warriors in mail ride not among the Gondolin, save it be old Salgant. And his mother laughed amid her sorrow. But Earendel said, Nay, where is Salgant? For Salgant had told him quaint tales or played drolleries with him at times, and Earendel had much laughter of the old gnome in those days when he came many a day to the house of Tuor, loving the good wine and fair repast he there received. But none could say where Salgant was, nor can they now. Mayhap he was whelmed by fire upon his bed, yet some have it that he was taken captive to the halls of Melko and made his buffoon. And this is an ill fate for a noble of the good race of the gnomes. Then was Earendel sad at that, and walked beside his mother in silence. Now came they to the foothills, and it was full morning but still grey, and there nigh to the beginning of the upward road folk stretched them and rested in a little dale fringed with trees and with hazel bushes, and many slept despite their peril, for they were utterly spent. Yet Tuor set a strict watch, and himself slept not. Here they made one meal of scanty food and broken meats, and Earendel quenched his thirst and played beside a little brook. Then said he to his mother, Mother Idril, I would we had good Ecthelion of the fountain here to play to me on his flute, or make me willow whistles. Perchance he has gone on ahead. But Idril said nay, and told what she had heard of his end. Then said Earendel that he cared not ever to see the streets of Gondolin again, and he wept bitterly. But Tuor said that he would not again see those streets, for Gondolin is no more. Thereafter, nigh to the hour of sundown behind the hills, Tuor bade the company arise, and they pressed on by rugged paths. Soon now the grass faded and gave way to mossy stones, and trees fell away, and even the pines and firs grew sparse. About the set of the sun, the way so wound behind a shoulder of the hills that they might not again look towards Gondolin. There all that company turned, and lo, the plain is clear and smiling in the last light as of old. But afar off as they gazed, a great flare shot up against the darkened north, and that was the fall of the last tower of Gondolin, even that which had stood hard by the southern gate, and whose shadow fell oft across the walls of Tuor's house. Then sank the sun, and they saw Gondolin no more. Now the pass of Cristhorn, that is the Eagle's Cleft, is one of dangerous going, and that host had not ventured it by dark, lanternless and without torches, and very weary and cumbered with women and children and sick and stricken men, had it not been for their great fear of Melko's scouts, for it was a great company, and might not fare very secretly. Darkness gathered rapidly as they approached that high place, and they must string out into a long and straggling line. Galdor and a band of men spear-armed went ahead, and Legolas was with them, whose eyes were like cats for the dark, yet could they see further. Thereafter followed the least weary of the women supporting the sick and the wounded that could go on foot. Idril was with these, and Earendel, who bore up well. but Tuor was in the midmost behind them with all his men of the wing, and they bare some who were grievously hurt, and Egalmoth was with him, but he had got a hurt in that sally from the square. Behind again came many women with babes, and girls, and lamed men, yet was the going slow enough for them. At the rearmost went the largest band of men battle whole, and there was Glorfindel of the golden hair. Thus were they come to Cristhorn, which is an ill place by reason of its height, for this is so great that spring nor summer come ever there, and it is very cold. Indeed, while the valley dances in the sun, there all the year snow dwells in those bleak places, and even as they came there the wind howled, coming from the north behind them, and it bit sorely. Snow fell and whirled in wind eddies and got into their eyes, and this was not good, for there the path is narrow, and of the right or westerly hand a sheer wall rises nigh 7 chains from the way, ere it bursts atop into jagged pinnacles where are many eyries. There dwells Thorondor, king of eagles, lord of the Thornhoth, whom the Eldar named Sorontur. But of the other hand is a fall not right sheer, yet dreadly steep, and it has long teeth of rock up-pointing, so that one may climb down, or fall, maybe, but by no means up. And from that deep is no escape at either end any more than by the sides, and Thornseer runs at bottom. He falls therein from the south over a great precipice, but with a slender water, for he is a thin stream in those heights, and he issues to the north after flowing but a rocky mile above ground, down a narrow passage that goes into the mountain, and scarce a fish could squeeze through with him. Galdor and his men were come now to the end, nigh to where Thornseer falls into the abyss, and the others straggled for all Tuor's efforts, back over most of the mile of the perilous way between chasm and cliff, so that Glorfindel's folk were scarce come to its beginning, when there was a yell in the night that echoed in that grim region. Behold, Galdor's men were beset in the dark suddenly by shapes leaping from behind rocks, where they had lain hidden even from the glance of Legolas. It was Tuor's thought that they had fallen in with one of Melko's ranging companies, and he feared no more than a sharp brush in the dark. Yet he sent the women and sick around him rearward and joined his men to Galdor's, and there was an affray upon the perilous path. But now rocks fell from above, and things looked ill, for they did grievous hurt. But matters seemed to Tuor yet worse when the noise of arms came from the rear, and tidings were said to him by a man of the Swallow that Glorfindel was ill-bested by men from behind, and that a Balrog was with them. Then was he sore afraid of a trap. And this was even what had in truth befallen, for watchers had been set by Melko all about the encircling hills. Yet so many did the valour of the Gondoth limb draw off to the assault ere the city could be taken, that these were but thinly spread, and were at the least here in the south. None the less one of these had espied the company as they started the upward going from the Dale of Hazels, and as many bands were got together against them as might be, and devised to fall upon the exiles to front and rear, even upon the perilous way of Cristhorn. Now Galdor and Glorfindel held their own despite the surprise of assault, and many of the orcs were struck into the abyss, but the falling of the rocks was like to end all their valour, and the flight from Gondolin to come to ruin. The moon about that hour rose above the pass, and the gloom somewhat lifted, for his pale light filtered into dark places, yet it lit not the path for the height of the walls. Then arose Thorondor, king of eagles, and he loved not Melko, for Melko had caught many of his kindred, and chained them against sharp rocks to squeeze from them the magic words whereby he might learn to fly, for he dreamed of contending even against Manwë in the air. And when they would not tell, he cut off their wings and sought to fashion therefrom a mighty pair for his use. But it availed not. Now when the clamour from the pass rose to his great eyrie, he said, "Wherefore are these foul things, these orcs of the hills, climbed near to my throne? and why do the sons of the Noldali cry out in the low places for fear of the children of Melko the Accursed? Arise, O Thorn-Hoth, whose beaks are of steel and whose talons swords. Thereupon there was a rushing like a great wind in rocky places, and the Thorn-Hoth, the people of the eagles, fell on those orcs who had scaled above the path, and tore their faces and their hands, and flung them to the rocks of Thorn Seer far below. Then were the Gondolin glad, and they made in after days the eagle a sign of their kindred in token of their joy, and Idril bore it, but Earendil loved rather the swan wing of his father. Now unhampered, Galdor's men bore back those that opposed them, for they were not very many, and the onset of the Thorn-Hoth affrighted them much, and the company fared forward again, though Glorfindel had fighting enough in the rear. Already the half had passed the perilous way and the falls of Thorn Seer, when that Balrog that was with the rearward foe leapt with great might on certain lofty rocks that stood into the path on the left side upon the lip of the chasm, and thence with a leap of fury he was past Glorfindel's men, and among the women and the sick in front, lashing with his whip of flame. Then Glorfindel leapt forward upon him, and his golden armour gleamed strangely in the moon, and he hewed at that demon that it leapt again upon a great boulder, and Glorfindel after. Now there was a deadly combat upon that high rock above the folk, and these, pressed behind and hindered ahead, were grown so close that well nigh all could see. Yet was it over ere Glorfindel's men could leap to his side. The ardour of Glorfindel drove that Balrog from point to point, and his mail fended from him its whip and claw. Now had he beaten a heavy swinge upon its iron helm, now hewn off the creature's whip-arm at the elbow. Then sprang the Balrog in the torment of his pain and fear full at Glorfindel, who stabbed like a dart of a snake. But he found only a shoulder, and was grappled, and they swayed to a fall upon the crag-top. Then Glorfindel's left hand sought a dirk, and this he thrust up that it pierced the Balrog's belly nigh his own face, for that demon was double his stature, and it shrieked, and fell backward from the rock, and falling, clutched Glorfindel's yellow locks beneath his cap, and those twain fell into the abyss. Now this was a very grievous thing, for Glorfindel was most dearly beloved, and lo, the dint of their fall echoed about the hills, and the abyss of Thorn Seer rang. Then at the death-cry of the Balrog, the orcs before and behind wavered and were slain, or fled far away, and Thorondor himself, a mighty bird, descended to the abyss and brought up the body of Glorfindel. But the Balrog lay, and the water of Thorn Seer ran black for many a day, far below in Tumladen. Still do the Eldar say, when they see good fighting at great odds of power against a fury of evil, "Alas, it is Glorfindel and the Balrog," and their hearts are still sore for that fair one of the Noldali. Because of their love, despite the haste and their fear of the advent of new foes, Tuor let raise a great stone cairn over Glorfindel, just there beyond the perilous way by the precipice of Eagle Stream, and Thorondor has let not yet any harm come thereto. But yellow flowers have fared thither, and blow ever now about that mound in those unkindly places. But the folk of the Golden Flower wept at its building, and might not dry their tears. Now who shall tell of the wanderings of Tuor and the exiles of Gondolin in the wastes that lie beyond the mountains to the south of the Vale of Tumladen? Miseries were theirs, and death, colds and hungers, and ceaseless watches. That they won ever through those regions infested by Melko's evil came from the great slaughter and damage done to his power in that assault, and from the speed and wariness with which Tuor led them, for of a certain Melko knew of that escape and was furious thereat. Ulmo had heard tidings in the far oceans of the deeds that were done, but he could not yet aid them, for they were far from waters and rivers, and indeed they thirsted sorely, and they knew not the way. But after a year and more of wandering, in which many a time they journeyed long tangled in the magic of those wastes, only to come again upon their own tracks, once more the summer came, and nigh to its height they came at last upon a stream, and following this came to better lands, and were a little comforted. Here did Voronwë guide them, for he had caught a whisper of Ulmo's in that stream one late summer's night, and he got ever much wisdom from the sound of waters. Now he led them even till they came down to Sirion, which that stream fed, and then both Tuor and Voronwë saw that they were not far from the outer issue of old of the way of escape, and were once more in that deep dale of alders. Here were all the bushes trampled and the trees burnt, and the dale wall scarred with flame, and they wept, for they thought they knew the fate of those who sundered aforetime from them at the tunnel mouth. Now they journeyed down that river, but were again in fear from Melko, and fought affrays with his orc bands, and were in peril from the wolf riders. But his fire-drakes sought not at them, both for the great exhaustion of their fires in the taking of Gondolin, and the increasing power of Ulmo as the river grew. So came they after many days, for they went slowly and got their sustenance very hardly, to those great heaths and morasses above the land of willows, and Voronwë knew not those regions. Now here goes Sirion a very great way under earth, diving at the great cavern of the tumultuous winds, but running clear again above the pools of twilight, even where Talkas after fought with Melko's self. Tuor had fared over these regions by night and dusk after Ulmo came to him amid the reeds, and he remembered not the ways. In places that land is full of deceits and very marshy, and here the host had long delay and was vexed by sore flies, for it was autumn still, and agues and fevers fared amongst them, and they cursed Melko. Yet came they at last to the great pools in the edges of that most tender land of willows, and the very breath of the winds thereof brought rest and peace to them, and for the comfort of that place the grief was assuaged of those who mourned the dead in that great fall. There women and maids grew fair again, and their sick were healed, and old wounds ceased to pain. Yet they alone who of reason feared their folk living still in bitter thraldom in the hells of iron sang not, nor did they smile. Here they abode very long indeed, and Earendel was a grown boy ere the voice of Ulmo's conches drew the heart of Tuor, that his sea-longing returned with a thirst the deeper for years of stifling, and all that host arose at his bidding, and got them down Sirion to the sea. Now the folk that had passed into the Eagle's Cleft, and who saw the fall of Glorfindel, had been nigh 800s. A large wayfaring, yet was it a sad remnant of so fair and numerous a city. But they who arose from the grasses of the land of willows in years after and fared away to sea, when spring set Celandine in the meads, and they had held sad festival in memorial of Glorfindel, these numbered but 300s and a score of men and man-children, and 263 of women and maid-children. Now the number of women was few because of their hiding or being stowed by their kinsfolk in secret places in the city. There were they burned or slain, or taken and enthralled, and the rescue parties found them too seldom, and it is the greatest ruth to think of this. For the maids and women of the Gondolin limb were as fair as the sun, and as lovely as the moon, and brighter than the stars. Glory dwelt in that city of Gondolin of the 7 names, and its ruin was the most dread of all the sacks of cities upon the face of the earth. Nor Babylon, nor Ninwi, nor the towers of Trui, nor all the many takings of Rum that is greatest among men, saw such terror as fell that day upon Amon Gwareth in the kindred of the gnomes. And this is esteemed the worst work that Melko has yet thought of in the world. Yet now those exiles of Gondolin dwelt at the mouth of Sirion by the waves of the great sea. There they take the name of Lothlim, the people of the flower, for Gondothlim is a name too sore to their hearts. And fair among the Lothlim Earendel grows in the house of his father, and the great tale of Tuor is come to its waning. Then said Little Heart, son of Bronweg, Alas for Gondolin!